Well, welcome everyone to this second week of the keynote lectures on the publication of our book, Space, Place and Religious Landscapes, Living Mountains. I'm Darylyn Gunsberg and my co-editor is Bernadette. Do you want to say hello, Bernadette?
Just welcome back, everybody. Many faces we saw from last week and new faces in this week. It's just great to see everybody. So yeah, welcome.
Yeah. If you didn't see the opening slide and you are new to these lectures, what we're going to do is keep everyone's mics off while John gives the lecture, probably anywhere between 35 and 45 minutes. Then we'll open the floor for questions up to 5 minutes to the hour. And if you type a question mark in the question box when we go to questions, then I will call on you to turn your mic on. At the question time, if you don't want to be recorded, because John is recording this lecture and it's up to him when he shares that link, but if you don't want people to see you in the question time, please just turn your webcam off. That would be appreciated. So that's all the housekeeping I think I need to do. It gives me enormous pleasure to introduce Jon Cannon, who's a colleague and a friend, dear friend. He is a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London. He's a research associate at the History of Art Department at the University of Bristol, and he's a canon historian at Bristol Cathedral. As an author and a historian, his academic focus is on medieval church architecture, and some of you might have seen his BBC documentary, which was on the making of a cathedral, and that's also a book that he's published to run with that. He's also co-edited an academic work on Bristol Cathedral called The Medieval Art, Architecture and History of Bristol Cathedral, and it's a tour de force, absolutely brilliant. We hope one day he'll do the same thing for St Mary Redcliffe. The manuscript he's currently working on is The Stones of Britain, A History of Britain Through Its Geology, and that's scheduled for publication in early 2022, and we can't wait to have that. But meanwhile, what we have got is we've got his wonderful presentation from our book. So I'm going to hand over to John.
Darylyn, thank you very much indeed. Hoping I'm coming over loud and clear so I can talk to you about time and place at Brentor, exploring an encounter, a sacred mountain. I can be relatively precise about the date of my first encounter with Brentor. It was in January 1974, and I was 11. Recently moved to the English West Country from London and out exploring with my mother. We drove down the road from Tavistock to Lidford. This view appeared on my right, a sudden rocky eminence, a tiny church at the top. This moment had a powerful, instantaneous impact on me, as if someone took a giant key, put it in a keyhole in my heart that I didn't even know existed, and turned it. I spent a lifetime trying to repeat, unpack, understand the emotions of that moment. I've managed to carve a fragile living out of the concerns which arose from it. Was this religious experience? Church atop hill is a religious building. The emotions revealed that day took various courses thereafter, but one was a brief adolescent engagement with charismatic Christianity, loose interpretation of which faith I've remained close to. I can't honestly say, however, that the word religious would have occurred to me at the time. The moment was intense, and it involved a range of responses: aesthetic, spiritual, intellectual, all felt at once. It was not the last time I felt like this. Today, I'm happy to describe such experiences as a hunt for the divine, which I mean some kind of sentience that unites and transcends all creation. Was it an example of Mircea Eliade's hierophany? I'm less sure about that. To me, these experiences have been more a powerful glimpse of possibility of the divine than an actual manifestation of it. Brentor does, however, play a foundational role in my own personal mythology. It is a sacred place for me, if by that we mean a place of utmost significance, offering a glimpse beyond the Quitodian. It is my own personal sacred mountain. And I think even my 11-year-old self would have agreed that the power of this first glimpse resided in two things: physical drama of Brentor's natural form, and the charge given to that form, the place of worship that occupies its highest point. No great body of religious tradition is attached to this rock, but it does support religious building. In this respect, it is different to those sacred mountains that are richly draped with mythologies, stories and ideas, but lack monumental architecture, such as Uluru, Ayers Rock, Olympus, Ararat, and comparable to those which a building is a fundamental part of any experience of the mountain, Aishan, Mont Saint-Michel. Indeed, Brentor can be placed with a significant Christian group of churches on hilltops dedicated to St. Michael. Saint-Michel de Arguy, Haute-Loire, France, and Glastonbury Tor are among them. One might add, the main evidence for the proposal that I'm not the first person to accord religious significance to the hill is that it has a church on top of it. This point is worth emphasising. From its foundation, this church partly had a parochial function. That it was intended to serve a surrounding lay population, yet at a location for baptisms, funerals, masses, the hill could not be more inconvenient. This site is a very conscious choice. Already then we have three structures to consider when analysing Brentor. One, physical and natural, hill itself. One, physical and artificial, church that tops it. And one belongs to the category called by Teilhard de Chardin noosphere, and by others mythosphere, the body of ideas and assumptions that human beings contribute to the natural world. At Brentor, these potentially include the whole panoply of medieval Christianity. A small patch of the Earth's surface has been enclosed, creating an outdoor enclosure, which was expected to be the setting for the moment of resurrection, and an indoor space in which a miraculous event of transformation and incarnation was enacted at a location dedicated to a specific saint, and that very determinedly fixed itself in the landscape, being atop a craggy mountainette. In the cosmos, being equally determinedly facing east. In this paper, I want to pick this landscape apart, to rebuild its development so as better to understand its power, to make comparisons to other such sites where particularly relevant. Throughout, it is worth pointing out that the power of buildings and the powers of landforms are akin. The actions to physical form, mediated through a range of cultural assumptions, this type of landscape should inspire awe, or be climbed, or be avoided. That kind of architecture indicates a place of worship. Architecture, in other words, is a kind of placemaking, an artificial theology, and vice versa. Mountain and a church, subsets, a wider thing called place. Such sacred places have been described by Thomas Tweed as differentiated. In this case, even before the church was built, Brentor, an isolated eminence and a feature of the landscape for miles around, had differentiated itself. One might place it in a category of naturally differentiated places, places which are likely to attract human reaction. Then consider sacred mountains be merely a subdivision of this category, naturally differentiated high places, perhaps. So, we should start our exploration where all landscape ends, theology. Here we have an origin myth for the landform, one that has been supplied by science. Its very verifiability is its added power. And it reminds us that even rocks are testaments, dynamic processes. Brentor sits halfway down England's southwest peninsula. It's on the 200-metre high plateau that lies between Brentor and Dartmoor, and which is sected the north-south running River Tamar. It stands on that plateau's eastern extreme. The Dartmoor Massif, which reaches 621 metres, begins only 2 kilometres away. Plateau. Sorry, here's the tour. Whoops. And Dartmoor. Plateau consists of Devonian and early Carboniferous sedimentary rocks, material gradually laid down on the seafloor about 650 kilometres to the south, and about 419 to 358 million years ago. These rocks were transported here by a tectonic event known as the Variscan orogeny. This bulldozing of the earth transformed rocks and caused lava to erupt onto the sea floor, leaving a spread of volcanic rocks in the nearby landscape, and this remnant, a small underwater volcano, which was probably active around 346 to 329 million years ago. It is made of basalt, magma that cooled quickly as it spilled into the water. Surrounding lava fields are the source of the locally popular greenish Herdwick pudding stone. More large-scale development took place as the Variscan events were drawing to a close from about 300 million years ago. The rocks that form both Brentor and the plateau around it are now positioned deep underground. A vast mass of magma known as a batholith welled up nearby. Rocks were contorted and cooked, forming mineral deposits. There was once a manganese mine at the foot of the tor. Brentor itself was made of harder stuff. Its rocks were comparatively unaffected. Batholith cooled slowly. It became a great granite mass. The landscape today is the result of the gradual, radical removal of huge amounts of material, especially in the last 60 million years or so, and a final shattering in the course of the ice ages, finishing about 10,000 years ago. The top of the once buried granite batholith is exposed at the surface, forming high country of Dartmoor and Bodminmoor. Our volcano is revealed too. The contorted sedimentary rocks that surround them are softer than either and have eroded more quickly, forming the lower plateau. The soils developed on these support a well-settled grazing country, while those that develop on the igneous rocks are thin and acidic and are suitable only for sheepwalk. Familiar divide between upland and lowland. Brentor, in conclusion, is a one-off. Older than the granites, younger than the sedimentary plateau, and, unlike either, born in the throes of a volcanic eruption. Its current form, largely the result of Ice Age erosive processes, is coincidentally or not, rather volcano-like. The hill has a shallow eastern and southern slope, and a very steep western one, which rises almost sheer to 2 peaks. Highest, largest to the south. It has the church on top of it. The northern peak, on the northwest corner, is more dramatic. The oldest sign of a human response to the tor is not the church, the earthwork at its bottom. I'll just cycle back. You can see that this aerial photograph, as well as on the plan. This is a steep-sided structure about 216 meters long, and it rings 3/4 of the Tor. Iron Age phase of it stops somewhere around here, while leaving significant low-lying area in the far southeast unprotected. It's most impressive at the Tor's steep northwestern corner, where it is 5 meters high externally. Builders placed here a monumental hornwork or entrance complex, funneling visitors down a corridor 10 meters long towards a narrow west-facing gateway. This is a hill fort, probably built towards the end of the Iron Age. It belongs to a group of such forts on Dartmoor, each of which have a single bank and a monumental entrance. The archaeologist Phil Newman also points out several, like this one, have the entrance facing away from the moor and are unfinished or unprotected in other places. Either some event interrupted their construction, or it was important to the builders that the structures looked like a hill fort, not they could actually be used defensively. This earthwork is also unusual for enclosing the bottom rather than the top of the Tor. Though practicality may be one reason for this, hill forts can occupy very steep and narrow hilltops. The Mithertap of Benachie, Aberdeenshire, is an example. At Brentor, it was clearly more important to enclose a reasonably large space than to maximise the visibility of the hill fort itself. It was clearly also important, to maximise the impact of approach from the northwest. Hornwork would have been an intimidating presence as one approached its jaws. With no church present on the southern peak, the dramatic northern peak would have been an even more thrillingly architectonic presence than it is today. Christopher Tilley has discussed the significance of paths and routes. Here one might add that entrances and thresholds are also important. Here, natural and artificial power combine to focus our experience on this northwest corner. There is no evidence for how the interior of the Tor was to be used. In general, Iron Age hill forts were more centres of trade and secular power and religious ritual. Indeed, their visibility and defensible nature makes this true of many naturally differentiated high places. The dividing lines between a defensive enclosure and a religious one are not necessarily clear-cut. Political authority might be held to be divinely ordained. Future generations might change the emphasis. In any case, we can generally regard this earthwork as the temenos, the outer level of enclosure, delineating the start of differentiated land, also seen, for example, in Hindu, Greek, and Egyptian temple complexes. Several such sites, the larger structure is located at the foot of the mountain and near the edge of the enclosure. Yon at the foot of Olympus is one example, Dai Miao at the foot of Taishan is another. At Brentor, hornwork may be regarded as an equivalent to these, managing access and making very visible the power with which the site was invested. And it does not mean that whatever went on the hilltop itself was insignificant, merely that we can say nothing about it. The sacrifices on Taishan emphasize the Chinese emperor's unique role as the fulcrum between heaven and earth, elided the political and the religious, and their site is merely a promontory of rock. There are other shallower earthworks on the Tor. Some will be associated with medieval and later sheep fairs and quarries. On the saddle between the North Peak and the southern one, archaeologist Tom Greaves has identified a confusing group of low earthworks which could include the foundations of an east-facing building about 15 meters long, and he suggested that this might have been a Christian site that preceded the building of the current church. We know that early medieval Christian sites in nearby Cornwall are known for reoccupying Iron Age hill forts, and that St. Michael is associated with early medieval reoccupations of prehistoric sites in our region. Without excavation, the nature and date of these remains unknown. The early medieval period we can also ascribe the first known piece of mythosphere related to the Tor, its name. This steep and poor rocky outcrop are of Manic Old English origin, so must postdate the 8th century Anglo-Saxon colonization of the area. Only one structure is ever known to have occupied the highest part of the Tor. That is the church. H.B.R. Feinberg cites a document of 1155 to 62 from the nearby monastery at Tavistock, which records that local magnate Robert Gifford had in the previous generation founded a church on the rock of Brentor, giving both church and rock to the abbey and carving out a small new parish around them. In 1224 to 45, we read that the abbey supplied a priest to this church, whose job was to celebrate daily offices in the name of the Giffords living and dead and of the parishioners. So Gifford's foundation was to be both a parish church and a venue for commemorative masses, intended to aid the passage through purgatory of his and others' souls. The parish, small, sparsely populated. This, combined with the inaccessible location, suggests the purgatorial function was dominant in Gifford's mind. This is confirmed when we turn to the most significant aspect of Brentor's mythosphere: dedication to St. Michael. The archangel's well-attested connection with high places reflects his role as the principal intermediary between heaven and earth, especially when it came to the afterlife. A key figure in the anticipated judgment, St. Michael played a crucial role in funeral rites. He is the glue between Gifford's motivation, the building of the church, and the role played by the Tor itself, perhaps including its encircling ring of Iron Age embankments. The church today is an east-west oblong, little under 12.5 metres long and 4.5 metres broad. Just 4 windows, one in each side wall, north and south, and one in each wall, and north and south doors, one of which has a substantial porch. Western tower adds 10 metres to the height of the rock. The church is made out of pieces of the local landscape, basalts of the Tor itself, moved from quarries on its southeastern flank, dressings of local Herdwick greenstone. A few enrichments. Dominant impression rests on the simple geometries of the horizontal church, squarish porch, and the vertical tower. To approach the Tor is to experience the complex interplay of frost-shuttered rock exposures topped the simple shift of one orthogonal form against another. Artificial and natural features are thus separated, while the church turns the flattish profile of the hill's highest point into an emphatic peak. The story of this building is not a simple one. Only the lower 2.5 metres or so of the nave south wall seem likely to be a remnant of Robert Gifford's church. That's here. Round-headed window just to the east suggests heightening and extension in a few decades of completion. Much shorter, with no sign of a 12th century north wall, this was originally a very small building indeed, and comparisons with other chapel-sized 12th century churches suggests neither a tower or a porch are at all likely. This building would have complemented the peak, rather in the manner of Chinese temples at Taishan or Wutaishan, rather than dominating it, as we see it today, Mont Saint-Michel. In 1285, the parishioners agreed to pay 3 shillings a year towards repair of the fabric and the ornaments of the church, and in 1319 the building was consecrated to Bishop Stapleton of Exeter. In the building, the emphatic lancet of the nave north window and the roll-moulded roof corbel brackets are typically 13th century, while the mouldings of the north and south doors are happier in the earlier 14th century. The church thus seems to have been through a substantial upgrade at this time, if perhaps to a more extended timetable than suggested by the documents. Again, at this point, there is no reason to expect a tower to exist. West wall would have remained a good 4 meters from the cliff. Identical north and south doors have hood moulds, suggesting there was also no porch. It's unusual for such doors to be of identical design. The function of north and south doors in medieval churches to provide processional paths, for example, on Palm Sunday, when the outside of a church was circumambulated. This is not a location in which one might expect such activities to be encouraged. This seems to be a core aim of these changes. Indeed, it is more usual for one door to be larger than the other, indicating that it is also the main entrance. It thus seems lay access less important than the correct performance of ritual. These changes also created lengthened chancel we see today, which emphasizes the building's east-west axis and the significance of its eastern end. Dowling and Bernadette inform me that the orientation is 5 degrees north of east. It would be interesting to investigate this further. Lengthened east end is the most common of all the changes we see being made to 12th century churches in later centuries. It was clearly as important in this location as elsewhere. There was an emphatic division between the priestly area in the east and the less sacred western part, suggested by the location of the north and south windows, just about visible here, and the single step to their east, which is known to predate the Victorian Restoration, and a rood screen would have stood here, the crucifixion above, and of course, medieval church would have been richly decorated and painted. Only surviving medieval fitting, the granite font, probably 15th century, and 2 bells, later recast. These changes seem to emphasize 2 features of the building: its ritual use and its orientation. They connect the church to the cardinal directions, to the turning of the liturgical year, and by extension, the spatial arrangement of the universe. Claudia Moser and Cecilia Feldman have emphasized how practice ritual is to be emplaced. This small church in a high place thus stood as a universalizing, ordering contrast to the chaotic energy of the rock beneath. Its power as a visible intermediary between heaven and earth is enhanced by these changes. Construction of the tower, a late development and a step change, the church's presence in the landscape. It's 15th or earlier 16th century in style, effectively a new peak to the hill, located alarmingly close to the precipice of the Tor, is this structure that made St. Michael's a diminutive cousin to other dramatic hilltop churches dedicated to St. Michael. It is the only part of the church that seeks to dominate the Tor visually. It might be added that such visibly tall structures are frequent in ambitious religious buildings and often deliberately evoke mountains, from the Sikharas or mountain peak spire of a Hindu temple to the Mesopotamian ziggurat, the Buddhist stupa. One might add church towers and minarets to this discussion and propose an architectural category of artificially differentiated tall buildings to match that of the naturally differentiated high place. There's a further dimension to the medieval landscape. Feinberg established that a Michaelmas sheep fair was founded on the hill in 1231, survived until 1550. Fair may have been the reason for the belated extension of the Iron Age earthworks around the southeastern portion of the Tor. With just 6 shillings and 8pence in 1836, the event is likely to have been only locally significant. It must have given a special intensity to the patronal feast on the 29th of September. During this time at least, the bounding earthwork really did act as a kind of tenomos. The church would have had its images destroyed and it would have been refitted for Protestant worship in the tumultuous decades following the 1539 dissolution of Tavistock Abbey. The building's site remained relevant, however. In 1791, Richard Polwell recorded Matthew 16, verse 18, "On this rock will I build my church," is written on a little tablet on the south wall of the nave. Textual wall plaques such as this are typical of the 17th century. Evocation of the solidly patristic St. Peter rather than the suspiciously mythological St. Michael marks a distinct shift in the mythosphere surrounding the building. Such changes offer an insight into how a sacred building can be reinterpreted, even within a single faith tradition. Plaque may have been installed as part of a post-Commonwealth enrichment, which included bells of 1668, slate-carved sundial of 1694, and a tomb slab for Walter and Alice Batten of Brinzerbach Farm of circa 1680. Many other wall plaques and gravestones have since joined this monument, especially from the 19th century onwards, making burial and commemoration in their post-Reformation form a visibly defining aspect of the site's function. The two most significant changes to the building at this time are undated. The porch was there in 1791. Its outer portal is made of large pieces of reused stonework, broadly 15th century character. The present east window dates to the restoration of 1889 to 90, which was extensive and included all the internal fittings and the roofs apart from the font. However, the window that preceded it was also not medieval, and its installation might have freed up the stones now forming this north door. In any case, it seems that the porch is post-medieval, predates the 1890s. The same is true of the churchyard beyond. Three sides of the peak, the hill, have been enclosed with a dry stone wall and substantial amounts of earth moved to raise a burial ground within them. At most times, it would have been this enclosure which functioned as the site's temenos. You can view the sequence fort, graveyard, church, and within the church, porch, nave, chancel, as embodying the onion skin layers of significance seen in many sacred spaces, arranging space in a hierarchy from the mundane, the holy, the sacred. The churchyard appears to be a two-phase structure. It's circular to the south, oblong to the north, and I propose that this northern part was enlarged, squared off at some point after 1791, when we have measurements, which I won't go into now, which suggest the present enclosure not in its current form. Whatever date the porch and the churchyard extension are, they prioritise lay access and make visible lay burial while directing visitors firmly up the steep, deep northern approach. We know from early maps that visitors have always approached from the west. This is the only firm indication of their path thereafter, except we know that a southern gate was downgraded at some point. It's just a couple of metal bolts in a rock to indicate its former existence. This northwestern approach reflected the new centre of population at industrial North Brentor, where a chapel of ease was also built in 1856, but it does emphasise arduousness of approach and the drama of the site, perhaps reflecting picturesque, romantic responses to landscape. Such changes are a reminder that approach routes matter and that they can constantly be reconfigured. Excuse me. In comparison, the monumental route, which is such a key feature of the sanctuary at Delphi, Greece, is a relatively late development. At Brentor, the switch from orientation, sacrament, ritual to lay access, picturesqueness, and burial. But it remains likely that the vast majority of worshippers have climbed the Tor from the west for over 2,000 years. If we pick this landscape apart, we find human history everywhere in it. Perhaps the most tantalizing aspect of this relates to the mythosphere. There are records of the 1830s of two stories relating to the church. One It was founded by a merchant who was lost at sea and guided into Plymouth Sound by the sight of Brentor rising above an obscured coast. The other, that its site was chosen by the devil, who relocated building works to the top of the Tor every night, until St. Michael appeared and pelted him with stones. Intriguingly, the story means that the devil determined the church's current location. The problem with these is that we know nothing of their date of origin, and that they are topoi, very similar to stories told of other churches in unusual locations. They may be very retrospective responses to the remarkable nature of the church's site. As myths, they are marvelous. As history, almost useless. It might also be said of the most recent development in the mythosphere of Brentor, the proposal that there is a St. Michael line, ley line or path of energy, connecting hilltop sites associated with St. Michael and St. George and running from St. Michael's Mount to Glastonbury, the Suffolk coast. This is a very recent idea, whose point of origin and authors are known. It's created a new mythology around the Tor, linking it to other places in the landscape. Few historians give credence to the idea of ley lines. They are an important part of the belief system that some present-day visitors bring to the site. This modern myth has served to re-sacralize the landscape, while adding a new layer to its mythosphere. At Brentor, a stone church built on top of an extinct sea volcano, surrounded by an unfinished hill fort, the edge of Dartmoor. Every stage of this story has a complex stratigraphy. Each transformed the phenomenological experience approaching the site. Brentor, it seems, has spoken to people in different ways, different times, and the resulting layered interventions have added to the conversation. None of this was known to me in 1974, neither is any ordinary visitor necessarily aware of it. Such encounters are with a place, not a history. They squash these layered experiences together to a kind of singularity. Perhaps this is one of the most significant qualities of sacred places, that in them time is experienced all at once, its many layers compressed. It is impossible to deny the power of the landform itself in all this. 11-year-old me might have had a few assumptions about dramatic landscapes in his head, perhaps from Narnia or works of Alan Garner. He knew nothing about St. Michael or the Reformation, hill forts or purgatory, geology or ley lines. My reaction was a testament to the power of place in its purest form. Thank you.
Wonderful, John. It's such an evocative story, and I'm sure people have got lots of questions to ask you. And if you want to ask John a question, please put a question mark in the question box and we'll call on you. Meanwhile, as people are sort of gathering their thoughts, because you've taken us through a very rich history, a whole palimpsest, and it's almost like it changes, but it's the same. And I wonder whether you still have that sense of epiphany or joy or whatever it was you felt as 11-year-old you, whether you still have that each time you go there.
I don't think it repeats in intensity, but it changes in character. I have, my own internal palimpsest of memories of, I once ran up the Tor at midnight because I happened to be sleeping overnight nearby. There's a whole series of bits of one's own biography that one thinks to special places like this. And certainly it's continued to have great power. There's no doubt at all about that.
Yeah, excuse me. Yes, and it's certainly influenced the path that you've taken in trying to understand what it was.
More than influence it, it's defined.
Yes.
That's the moment from which everything I've done in my working life spools out. It's quite extraordinary, really.
Yes, absolutely. It's a wonderful how it doesn't matter how young you are, but you get that call, and if you follow the call, it changes your life.
Perhaps that is a crucial age. You're just at the cusp of puberty, and the germs of who you're going to be, and all the kind of mixed up stuff that goes on as hormones start to kick in. It's perhaps not surprising, and we just moved house. There's all kinds of reasons why that moment might have coincided with this event in stimulating ways.
Yes. Well, the questions are flooding in now. John Titterton has said, how deep is the topsoil for excavating graves?
Well, as I was saying, I think almost all of the graveyard has been moved there to create a topsoil for excavating graves. And that's an underestimated major work of the creation of the landscape. We tend to notice the building, not the work that's gone into creating the graveyard. There's a famous quotation from an 18th century traveller who says, "Doubtless the dead rest there as happily as they do in Great St. Peter's." And I should think at its deepest point, the topsoil is only as deep as the dry stone wall itself, which is, I guess, 4 or 5 feet high.
Yes. Jarita Holbrook has said, have you thought about the gendered aspects of the site, male versus female aspects?
Very interesting question. Obviously, the church is dedicated to a male saint. Beyond that, I'd like to have a discussion. You have thoughts?
Jarita, do you want to put your mic on and expand on this, or do you have any thoughts?
All right. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
So just the photo that you have there seems to be, I'm looking at it, I think it's very feminine, right? The two hills are very feminine, yet the church itself seems to be, a little bit phallic, and I mean, just going by the shapes of things. But that's only my impression. I would like to have heard of other people actually said things like, the feminine hill. Yes. Or, the masculine church,
Indeed. I haven't come across that at all in the literature. In some parts of the country, double-peaked, smooth-rounded hills get called caps, for example, in Scotland. They're immediately linked to breasts. If there's ever been a tradition like that at Brentor, no sign of it. It's worth saying that northern peak, if you approach from the direction that the Iron Age wanted you to approach, and that present path wants you to approach, there's maybe a couple of 100 yards when you really feel like there are two things. Most of the rest of the time, you feel like there's one thing with a crag to one side, which makes it a bit less breast-like, a bit more pimple-like. Yes, and I'm sure there's a broadly phallic dimension to my very differentiated artificial tall places. These towers that one gets in Christian and Muslim architecture and universally in religious architecture.
Yes, lovely. Yes, it's such a moot question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Chris,
of course, culture is likely to squash the female aspect, knowing the way things have gone.
Yes, that's right. And it's interesting that you take this picture and we see that one image of it, whereas anything which is in the landscape or is always three-dimensional, isn't it? We move around and we see it change.
That's right. And that's something that's constantly bothered me with it. I'll just sort of backtrack slightly. The Iron Age want you to come through here, and today you have to come through here, kind of curve your way up. Shallower approaches, the natural ways of approach, leaving aside where settlements are and things, are over here. That's a much gentler experience. Long, broad slopes. You want to gender them? No, this is a stereotype, but they're softer, more feminine. Whatever you do with gender, it's quite clear that you could read this site very, very differently depending on where you approach it. And we know there was once a gateway on the southern side, which suggests that at some point people have wanted to come up a rather different way. Interesting.
Good question. Thank you, Jarita. Chris has said, is the graveyard still in use?
Yes, it is, remarkably. I don't know what the legalities are of 4 or 5 feet of artificially created topsoil, but unless these are the new burial there last time I went. Now, maybe it was just ashes marked by a gravestone, but I was surprised to see it there. And there are certainly early 20th century tombstones there.
So are there constant services being held there? Or is
I think there's there's certainly a big a hymn service once a year, which is kind of a big local event. I don't think, I could be wrong, that anymore there's a Sunday service. That's down in the village of North Brentor, and it's very much maintained as a place of worship. You know, it's a place to climb. It's a tourist attraction as much as anything else now for local people.
Yes.
It doesn't have a huge national profile, even though it's quite a remarkable thing.
Yes, yes. Frank has said he has a comment on the orientation for you.
Thank you.
Yeah, John, firstly, congratulations. Very profound and wonderful presentation. Really enjoyed it. Well done. And Bernadette and Darlene may have done this already, but given the high elevation of the church and its easterly orientation in terms of the axis, it's very likely that you have a depressed or negative horizon in terms of its angular altitude, which would work in favor of an easterly orientation at equinox. So a simple measurement on site, or it could be done on a computer-based system, would determine that for you.
And the Feast of St. Michael is, I think, 8 days after the September equinox. So that's actually thought too.
But I think the key is that you have a negative horizon, most likely because of the high altitude. And I presume the horizon is distant.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So that could be explored, and you could pin that one down for your further consideration.
What Frank is saying, John, is that the church may be facing, as far as it's concerned, directly at the equinox rising sun.
Yes.
Right,
I understand that.
Yeah.
Or potentially at the rising sun on the day of its patronal festival.
On the day of the patronal festival. Absolutely.
Would you be able to distinguish the two, or would that be?
Yes.
Oh, you could.
Yes,
you could.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So there's your next one.
We can help you there, John, if you need more numbers.
That was the idea.
Or just get me a helicopter and get me over there.
Yeah. We'll meet you there, Frank.
At your expense.
Tim has a question. Are all the corbel carvings of Christian culture, or are there any more any alternatives, such as in Studland, Dorset?
There are no figurative carvings of any kind. All the detailing of the architecture is incredibly simple and plain and geometrical. All medieval imagery has gone from the church.
So I take it the stained glass is Victorian, is it?
It's early 20th century.
Yeah. Yes. Norchaka has got a comment. I think it's just really about the awe that you felt, and is extrapolating that this awe could be felt by looking at, a mountain on the planet of Mars or something like that. Maybe I've got that incorrect. Norchaka, do you want to put on your mic and you can ask your question?
Yeah, maybe it's just theoretical. Thank you anyway for a wonderful presentation. Maybe I take first more down to earth questions. One thing is that, do you think that this kind of awe feeling can only or mostly be attributed to places where there has been a kind of spiritual gathering, churches or similar? And so you have more that kind of feelings on such places where people have actually dedicated to spiritual issues, rather than on just a lake where there was nothing or whatever. Do you think there's so humans have actually given that site an additional portal for these feelings, or is it just everywhere in nature?
I'm sure that one can have experience. In fact, I think a lot of people find that they get this experience most intensely in places which seem to have no human intervention at all. And I'm sure the fact that they get enriched by people, it's kicked off by people having that kind of experience of something which appears to be untouched. But I certainly personally find that visible layering of reaction through different cultures and different times and different histories enriches that experience. And it's often that combination of the natural and the artificial that excites me most.
Okay. Can I ask one more thing before I get to the Mars thing? Some places like Stonehenge, they have this with cycles, equinox and so on, that kind of things. Do you think that there would be something here too, so that you would have special feelings during special solar cycles here, summer equinox or whatever, then, or I don't know, do you think there's a difference with regard to time?
Well, obviously the turning of the seasons, the changing of the light affects
of course,
the experience that any individual will have. Talking of what we can say in terms of evidence of this particular building, all we really have is the church. Church is orientated on the cardinal directions. It's facing east. There's this very possible link to the September equinox, given significance of the Feast of St. Michael. So consciously or unconsciously, that period in particular is, that's when there's a big gathering on the Tor for sheep fairs. A particular part of the natural year is going to really count for people at Brentor, and beyond that, I don't think the evidence can't go any further here.
Okay. And now to if I may, my crazy question, because we all know about the media presence about the Mars exploration and everything, and everybody are so excited about visiting other planets, meteorites, and asteroids and so on. And I wonder, this kind of spiritual awe feeling, do you think we can only feel it on Earth because here are humans, or could we also feel it on other places in the universe? Because I mean, because now it's all very technological. We have taking samples, and there's a rover driving there, and we're only facing that kind of things. I miss all this awe that we can feel on Earth, and I wonder, it's probably silly, people are going to say that, but would it be possible what we have now? Because I actually now think it's a little bit too technological now, everything that we hear about the rest of the space. And yeah, so it's, I was just figuring, when you talk about this feeling for the mountain and so on, would we be able to develop the same kind of feeling for a mountain on Mars? I don't know.
Yeah, I'm sure we would. And actually, I think we tend to put science and emotion into different boxes, but I'm quite sure that, just as archaeology and history are kind of a scientific, logical way of connecting to one's ancestors, so exploring the cosmos scientifically through astronomy is ultimately stimulated by the extraordinary awe that we feel when we look up at the heavens. And the way, there's the whole business of the study of cosmos and culture that Darylyn and Bernadette are all about. It's stimulated by that basic emotion, and a particular place ease into that by being very emphatically oriented on the cardinal directions, and so talking about underlying cosmic patterns that apply to the planet consciously or unconsciously, and place it in space.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, you see, you stimulate such deep questions inside us, John, with your exploration here, and it's so many levels to go through about the you at 11, who has seemingly tabula rasa in terms of
Almost.
and then just feeling something so connected, so deep and so connected to this place that it changes your life forever. And astronauts talk about the overview effect, don't they, when they look back at the Earth and how it changes their life. And I think that there is a similarity with that one can take the micro and the macro in equal measure about and understand and unpack the nature of awe, which you've been doing with this extraordinary building, this extraordinary landscape. Okay, any other questions, please? Everyone's just saying it's been really wonderful, and I think then what we need to do now is to turn our own mics on, and if we can please thank Jon for an absolutely wonderful presentation with such stimulation and ideas to think about and take away. So please, let's give him a round of applause and thanks.
Thank you, Jon.
Wonderful.
Stop sharing.
Break.
Yes, if you stop recording and stop sharing, and then we will take a 5-minute break.